Don't use all your good material off mic.
Let's throw that in before we start.
Yeah. Okay, let's go. The presenting sponsor for Socially Democratic is Dunn Street. Dunn Street is a campaign agency that specialises in community organising. We only work with people who want to build power to make the world a better place. And if you want to create change in 2025, then hit us up at dunstreet.com.au. A special shout out to all of our Patreon members as well. And you can join our community for free or for as little as $1.50 a month. And you too can help support this podcast. All paid members receive a welcome gift. So if you have recently signed up, please check your inbox for a message from our producer asking for your shipping address, because without that, then we can't send you your merch. And finally, today's episode is brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. For over a century, Maurice Blackburn has stood up for fairness, championing the rights of everyday Australians and shaping landmark legal reforms. Today, they're harnessing new technologies to make justice more accessible, more efficient, and more responsive to the needs of modern Australia. All right, let's get on with today's episode. It's time for our second episode of the Mailbag, Socially Democratic. I don't have a name for it yet. That's something that will happen over time, I feel. But in order to... So basically, we asked everyone on our Patreon community, can you send in some questions or discussion topics? And we'll get two guests to come on the show and talk about them. And so people have sent in questions, and I've found two guests. And our two guests are, first of all, he's the Director for Campaigns and Strategy at Unions New South Wales, which is the peak body for trade unions in that wonderful state. And it's great to have you back on the show. Todd Pinkerton, welcome back to Socially Democratic.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Haven't spoke to you since your glorious predictions of all the seats that we won at the federal election.
Yeah, we talked afterwards. We talked about how bad we are at predicting how good we are.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. That's true. And our second guest, she's the former Chief of Staff to Daniel Andrews, the longest serving Labor Premier in the state of Victoria, and now she's a Managing Partner at FMRS Advisory. Welcome back, Lissie Ratcliff.
Thanks for having me, Stephen.
And also a big thank you to all of our Patreon community subscribers who sent through your mailbag questions and topics of discussion for this week. We will try to get to all of them. I'm holding a couple back for the Feeney files. There was one particular question on AUKUS, which I think is very much in David's wheelhouse, and a question on media comms, which is very much in Jesse's wheelhouse. So I'll put those to them at the end of the month when we do our monthly wrap. So let's get to the ones that we have received. And the first one really is about ministers' workload. It's from Jerry. Jerry writes, as one Labor minister once said, I'm the Minister for Suburbs. And Jerry says, I don't know what that means. Sounds like a Jerry Seinfeld opening monologue. But it makes me wonder why most ministers don't feel the same way. Aside from Jim Chalmers, who's clearly trained his whole life to be treasurer, most Labor MPs usually are lawyers or union officials, and they get thrown into portfolios that they know nothing about. And he says, take Claire O'Neill, the Home Affairs Minister, which I think Jerry may have meant Housing, Homelessness and Cities Minister. The information overload must be enormous. I'm not criticising her. It's just the system. How can you show real leadership in a gigantic and complex department that you barely understand? I'm not sure if Claire would agree with that. But does that mean that the public service ends up running the show? That's a question from Jerry. So thank you, Jerry. Lissie, I want to go to you, first of all, to take a stab at this. Do you think you need expertise as a minister in a particular portfolio?
So I'd say, Stephen, not necessarily when you start out. Like the evidence and expertise is meant to sit in the public service, which is a permanent, ongoing institution in every part of every state in Australia and Commonwealth as well, and other systems that ours is based on. The role of ministers is, one, they're democratically elected, obviously, and then they're appointed to the cabinet, and their role is to bring their general skills and decision-making and judgment on behalf of the people who've elected them to those roles. So I'd say ministers certainly develop expertise, and just sometimes they bring it with them already. They may have had a previous role in that sector, but if they haven't, then they develop it by, they get briefed, they meet with stakeholders and other experts in those areas, and that's develops over time. It's obviously better if you can be in a portfolio for a longer period of time. The longer you're there, the more you'll know. But I don't think, I personally, no, I don't think it's necessary that you have a background in the portfolio. Otherwise, we'd only ever have sector experts. And I think you can actually come into these jobs knowing too much and specialising too much in a particular industry. And then you bring with it all those sort of pre-existing ideas and notions, which means sometimes you don't actually have greenfields thinking and you're not as open to new ideas. So I think a balance is important in that, and you should be open to getting input from the experts, but they're there to synthesise all the information they get and also to represent, the will of the people. Like politicians have a really important role and ministers have an important role in understanding what the community want and what's important for them. And, that's not always going to be aligned with whatever the public service is advising. So it's about finding that balance. So I'm going to defend Claire and everybody else here and say, she was the Minister for Home Affairs. She's now got a whole range of other portfolios which are super different, but she will bring the skills that she has as a minister to both of those and make decisions accordingly.
Because it's not like, there's been examples in the past where we've had a minister for early childhood education who didn't have any children. We've had ministers for sport that probably wouldn't know how to hold a cricket bat, but on the flip side, like certainly in Victoria, the Attorney General has always come from a legal background, and I'd like to turn that table upside down and say, well, why does it have to be someone who's more learned, just to shake things up a little bit? Maybe it needs a less kind of, I know they're a little cliquey group, the lawyers, and they all like to hang out with each other, but maybe bringing someone from the outside would actually be a healthy thing when it comes to the Attorney General. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, Lissie. Is that a bit too controversial? Or?
Well, look, it would definitely be controversial. I mean, you're right. It doesn't technically have to be, the attorney doesn't have to be someone who's got a law degree or has practiced as a lawyer. I think everyone who's been the attorney, right, in the current state government has been. But, that's the balance, right? The profession, as I think they call themselves, certainly with the view that it has to be one of them who is the chief law officer. Maybe there's an argument that someone else could equally do a good job and bring a different kind of thinking. Then you've got to balance, you've got to be able to get the courts to do things and all the rest of it. So it's yes, that portfolio is a particular point of contention. But you don't need an Olympic athlete to be the sports minister. You need someone who's willing to be interested in the content and is a good public administrator and can deliver outcomes in the portfolio. It's not like, I don't think the health minister needs to be a doctor. Like it's not, or a nurse. Like you don't have to be that to be a good minister.
Todd, what are your thoughts on that? Do you think that you need to be an expert in that field before you can take on the role?
No, obviously not, right? Because we've had some great ministers who probably knew nothing about the portfolio before they got in, and then others who've known everything about it and haven't done great once they've been in there. Maybe also because there's an expectations game attached to what you did beforehand. But in reflections on this question, I've been thinking about just the complexity of things that an MP and a minister, for that matter, would have to be across, right, to be an effective minister. Like beyond being a minister, you've got to be, pre-selected to a seat. That takes a whole bunch of work you've got to be maintaining focus on. You've got to get elected to your seat. Now, easier said than others, depending on the margin of your seat. There's a whole, like the things that must chew up the attention span of a minister at the highest level, right? Pre-selection, electoral politics, becoming a minister. Then there's
staying a minister.
Staying a minister, right? Then like the mechanics of government. And that was where I draw into this idea about, do you need expertise, right? The thing we want our politicians and ministers to be experts in is the method of government, understanding the role of the expenditure review committee, understanding the role of a cabinet submission, getting a sort of sense about how does a collegiate cabinet make a decision. Like there was a sort of like quote or speech that former Premier Bob Carr was giving in New South Wales a couple of years ago about politics as a vocation. That politics seems to be this profession that people think if you're just good at a job, you'd be great at the politics of the job. And that's not necessarily the case. Like to be a good politician requires this sense of what's possible, where can you push the public, where does the public have to push you, the role of the media, the complexity of all that stuff. And I think that's what we want our politicians to be experts in, the politics. And that's probably that's probably not the most PR answer, right? Like we want our politicians to be the policy experts. But obviously, as Lissie said, the public service is meant to provide that role. Like they provide this expert advice. That being said, the other thing I would think about is because of the complexity of things that you would have to be across, no wonder we talk all the time about politicians and ministers getting somewhat captured by the department or by industry. And I'm not thinking of anyone in particular in that case, but you'd want a lot of friends telling you what the simple solutions are to problems, because how else would you get across the amount of things you've got to get across? Like, there's a reason people end up relying very heavily on these sort of perceived experts from both industry, from inside the department or outside, or from other politicians, etc. And I don't know if you guys have read that, that book that everyone's been talking about, Abundance, by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson, right? They got this big thing about complexity, about just like things are more complex today than they've ever been, like systems of government and laws. Like, maybe the job of being a minister is getting more complex as a result. I think about all the legislation you're going to be across all of the pieces, technologies, we'd be regulating new technologies that we haven't experienced deeply ourselves. All of that stuff is, I think, really interesting as well. And that's what this question is also talking about.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with that. I think it is more complex probably than it's ever been. And I think that, good ministers, and the best ones I've ever worked with, are the ones who understand, that the public service has a role to give them advice about things, but they do things like they just ask why, like rather than just having the accepted wisdom, which often, like there's a lot of inertia around public sector, which drives people crazy, rightly. But good ministers, like they insist that progress is made, and they, to your point, Todd, like they drive for outcomes. So their ability to, marshal the social license both within the government to make whatever their thing is a priority and deliver an outcome there, but then also be able to actually take that out of the government and, sell it to their stakeholders, the media, the public, building that case for reform or change or whatever it might be. Like, they know how to pull the levers, and being if you're a good minister and you know how to pull the levers in general, you will be able to do that in any portfolio. Obviously people have more interest in some things than others, but yeah, there is a professional technical aspect to holding that executive role in government that lends itself to anything. But yeah, it's not accepting that someone has said, well, we can't do that, minister, because we've never done it that way before. Like, good ministers don't accept that as that is not a good enough answer.
Do you think that the role between government ministers and departments has evolved over the last, I don't know, I'm going to randomly pick a number, the last 20 years? Like, you watch the old, and I know that the public service in Britain probably operates on a different level, but growing up watching Yes Minister, the gag was that Humphrey was just basically trying to put the brakes on any idea that Jim Hacker had. And you fast forward to 2025 and, Lissie, when you were on the show last time, we were talking about one of the reasons why the Victorian state government was successful under the leadership of Daniel was because of what you just talked about there, that you had very active ministers that were outcomes driven. Is that do you think that's rare across state and federal governments of both? Well, let's just focus on the Labor Party. Is it rare that we find government's ministers that are very, very proactive or too polite to be able to say to departments, no, this is how we're going to do it and you're going to take direction from us? Todd, I don't know if you can speak about what's going on in New South Wales right now, but is the New South Wales government seen as a very proactive government that's trying to roll out a lot of the ideas that they took to the last state election?
It's a mixed bag, right? I mean, particularly because they were out of government for some time, and I think only the Attorney General, Michael Daly, might have been the only one who served previously as a minister, and so has a direct experience. That being said, a number of today's ministers in New South Wales have formerly been chief of staff, so have been right close up to the action in the former government. But there's definitely some ministers who are perceived as really active, who are really pushing agenda, really got something that they're taking and run with it. Like, I think I don't know if we'll get a chance to talk about housing later, but the planning minister, Paul Scully, is one of those people who seems like he's got really an agenda. He's got a thing he wants to do and achieve in this ministry. Where others, I think maybe it's a bit more guided by the department. And I guess that's a bit of a mixed bag, right? It just depends on the issue and also how salient is your issue in the community that's the government's got social license to do something on, and how core it is to the voters that put them there in the first place. Mm.
I think to maybe pick up that point from Todd, Stephen, I think that governments that come in after long periods of opposition inevitably have a harder time because those skills people become ministers or in some cases premiers without having had that experience before. So something that probably stood the current Victorian government in good stead was that when they were elected in 2014, was they'd only been out of office for 4 years. So that core group of people who formed the senior part of the cabinet, so that's Daniel Andrews, but current Premier Jacinta Allen, former Deputy Premier James Merlino, Lisa Neville, a whole lot of others, Mark McCullough, they'd all been ministers and in some cases senior ministers in the previous government. They had 4 years in opposition. We win again, they get back into government. They already know how to be ministers. Like they've done the training wheels phase, so they hit the ground running. Like they've got an agenda, but they know how to execute it. Like they've been there, done that already. Whereas if you've been out for 10, 11, 12 years, whatever it is, which I think the current Queensland LNP government has experienced a bit of this. Like they were out for ages. So you just if you haven't done it before, like anything else, it's a new job. It takes a while to work out how to be good at a new job. It doesn't mean you're not talented or smart or any of those things. It's just new, and working out how to get the public service to do what you want. Because you're right to your yes minister point. Like I've experienced this. Sometimes public servants don't want to implement whatever the decision is. Like you can snow things, you just slow it down and you just suffocate it. And ministers have got so many things on their desk they're trying to do. Sometimes you just don't get back to it, and the public service will just suffocate it and sort of take it off the agenda that way.
There's a good segue maybe into a question that we've got from Claire. Claire asks, why does the Labor Premier Chris Minns appear to be behaving like a right-winger regarding industrial relations, youth justice, support for the unions? Please let me know if I should send in a list of disappointments. She does say that she's currently a Victorian living in Sydney, and do I have too high expectations? To you, Todd, just are we being a little bit harsh on the Minns government? I mean, they've been in for 2 years now. As Lissie said, takes time to settle into the job. I know that took me 12 months when I started working at the SJ to realise I wasn't going to be any good as an industrial officer. My secretary told me, stop doing this. We're going to make you an organiser. How do you rate the early days of this new Minns Labor government?
Well, it's good to know that on my third podcast appearance, Stephen, the softball questions have now finally ended. And it's time for some hardball things, getting in trouble. What do I think of the government at the moment? So there's a few – I'd describe myself firstly. Like I'm not necessarily like a cheerleader for everything the government has done. And obviously, you mentioned Steve and I work at Unions New South Wales. We've had some high-profile disputes with the government in the last couple of months, in the last couple of years. And I do think that some of that is about expectation management. I think we've all been under we had 12 years of a Liberal government that seemed pretty Teflon in a lot of ways, despite doing a lot of things that progressive organisations really struggled with or opposed. They had a big round. They did some pretty severe workers' comp cuts in 2012. There was about $100 billion worth of public assets that were privatised, and there was it was quite some time for the Labor Party to build back, and so there was absolute elation when we had the result of the recent election, and so the election of the Minns Labor government. And I think there maybe has been that expectation gap where I think there's a lot of advocacy, I think, from left voters and left-wing organisations and the progressive side of politics that why haven't we done the full, radical socialisation of the Premier state in the first 2 years? Why has that not been completed yet? But that being so, there's a little bit of that expectation, which I don't think this government, their approach is to do that. And if I was to put, I think if you were to put, the Premier on or someone from his office or someone from it, I think the pitch that they would make is New South Wales is obviously very different to Victoria, very different electoral politics in a lot of ways. It's not nearly what's Victoria described as the Massachusetts of Australian politics, right? We don't have quite the same dynamic in New South Wales. So a lot more, slightly more conservative, very industrial based, very heavy on the suburbs. And I think this government they're a minority government. They're propped up by independents who are pretty centralist. Their politics and their advocacy has been pretty much based around the centre, particularly the two rural independents who are providing supply. And they also don't have a majority in the upper house, and so they've got to pick a lot of options to get their things through. And obviously, your questioner has made some points about a bunch of things that they personally didn't love about what the government's opted. But I would say that there are a bunch of things I think the government's done that's been really, really progressive, notwithstanding the fights we've had. But there's been an absolute record investment in social housing. It's about $6 billion they've done into social and public housing, which is pretty amazing. New South Wales, a state that, I think this summer, they're going to have the first pill testing trials at festivals in Sydney, which is a movement on drug decriminalisation and harm minimisation in New South Wales is a really slow-moving beast, and it normally takes big moments like drug summits to achieve. So there's been things like that I think have been really positive. There's also been a lot of work in housing, and I'd love to talk more about that beyond. But they've passed a policy which is essentially like a finance guarantee for developers. So if they build homes, they can borrow knowing that if no one buys them, which is pretty hard to do in Sydney, the state government will pick them up. And if the state government picks them up, they'll own them and rent them out to people. So that's like government-owned housing to build housing. Like that's pretty left-wing and pretty progressive for respect to policy. But to the point about where they are in industrial relations and with unions, I think 12 years of stagnant wages under the last government, COVID was the straw that broke the camel's back. That last election, in many ways, was a referendum on the treatment of essential workers and the fact that the pay and conditions of essential workers were effectively the service delivery conditions of the citizens of New South Wales, and that a wages cap was making it harder for them to do that. There's definitely been a push to catch up on those wages, and unions have been making some strong advocacy on that. There's been some advocacy, there's been strikes, there's a few cases in the IRC that are running at the moment around this. And the government has said that they're going to pay more than the Libs did, but they're not necessarily going to meet every demand that's been made. And so there's that tussle. I guess one of the things to think about, like that expectation management, right? One of the benefits of like compulsory voting is that we always get politicians that speak to the centre and they speak to us the broadest range that they can. But the downside of that is you're very rarely getting a politician who agrees with every single thing you say because your vote matters just as much as anyone else. Like it's never going to go off to the left or the right in an extreme way. I'd be interested in people's thoughts, maybe, and particularly from you down south, about how you think the government's going from our end. But there's definitely room to move. There's definitely things they can do more of. There's definitely more story and a narrative they can bring together. And housing is going to be this huge challenge they're going to have to face in the next election. But we did get some early signs about how the government's probably going electorally, and that was in the Kiama by-election, which very unique circumstances, former Liberal, found guilty of child sexual assault, been imprisoned, had to have a by-election. It's former Liberal now, and it wasn't independent when they resigned. You would expect the government to win that, but you don't often expect governments to win by-elections off other parties, and they absolutely smashed that one in. So it'd be interesting to find out, and I'd like to compare that result a little bit to Aston before the last federal. Like, is it unique circumstances and context, or actually is it the beginnings of seeing that there's a lot of popularity growing on this government?
Yeah, it's an interesting point you make, and I'll go to Lissie in a moment just to get her sort of observations of the government from the outside. But to add on to that, Todd, my ears are burning right now because I can hear everyone in South Australia from the Labor Party screaming how they've had a bunch of by-elections in Liberal heartland and have won them in the first term as well. So we are seeing examples of new Labor governments winning and then by-elections that are in turf that they would normally not historically be successful do quite well. Now, we haven't had a South Australian election subsequently since then, but all markers point to a Malinowskis landslide in March next year, touch wood. And maybe that's a positive version of a canary in the coal mine for you guys as well in Kiama, that things are actually tracking quite well for the New South Wales Labor government.
And you do remind me of a point, which is, I think, in terms of the style of leadership that is the Premier of New South Wales, I think he looks very much towards South Australia and Malinowskis for the sort of style of leader that he wants to be, one that governs from the centre. They do progressive things, but I think their view is you can have more license on progressive things if you get the sort of the ABC, the basic service delivery stuff, right? Yeah. And that's why this government talks a lot about health, it's a lot about education, and it's a lot about housing. And then where they do these sort of progressive social value, social justice issues, they don't trumpet as much because they're sort of outcome orientated rather than the sort of the narrative orientated with respect to it.
It's interesting that Chris Minns has taken that from Peter Malinowskis. Geez, I wonder, Lissie, where Peter got that idea from.
Yeah, I think I'm going to be parochial for a second, Todd, forgive me. But I think both Daniel Andrews and Jacinta Allen would be within their rights to be sending some invoices of trailing commissions to both South Australia and New South Wales, because things have a way of kind of starting here and then finding themselves both west and north of the border. But anyway, good ideas should be socialised everywhere. I think one of the things I think is interesting about New South Wales is like the media is quite different up there, and my observation is that there's a lot more talkback radio focus up there than there is in Victoria, but that the newspapers seem to spend a lot less time on state politics than you would find in the Melbourne papers. So it's not that they never write about it, but it's just not as, if you open the Age or the Herald Sun on any given day, it's like smashed with 6 or 7 things they think the government's doing wrong on any given day, whereas that seems to be less the case in New South Wales. I do think, though, that, which I'm sure has an impact on how the government thinks about things, I do, though, think that that's interesting, Todd, the observation you make that, you do the basics right and gives you license to do sort of more progressive things. I think that is absolutely the mantra of the Victorian government as well, like under Daniel, but absolutely still under Premier Allen now. I think it's an interesting point, though, to say that, they're less focused on the narrative. And I think if I take us out of the country for a second, I think, that's something that the UK Labor, like Keir Starmer's also sort of said, I'm not, he's not here for the narrative. And yet that is a government in the UK that is drowning without a story right now and as absolutely losing its social licence. So it's interesting. Obviously, New South Wales government is absolutely not in that position. They look to be going well and they're in a strong position. But I do think there is a risk for governments that if you don't tell your story, someone else will end up defining what it is. So, and I'm saying this obviously as an outsider from New South Wales, but I'm interested whether you think there, because Todd, the Liberal Party in New South Wales looks to me like they've got some issues, not as many issues as the Victorian Liberal Party, which is a rolling disaster. But is the government telling enough of its own story? I know the election's still a ways away, but are they telling enough of their own story?
I think there's definitely an effort to tell a story. Like, I don't think they don't have a focus on the narrative. They definitely want to. I mean, I think the government wants to present itself very heavily as it's in the centre, it governs for everyone in the state, it delivers on the bread and butter, and will also pick up along the way some of these additional issues. But they're not looking to get wedged, though. They're not looking to give ground to the Libs to give them things to jump on. I think that's also been part of it. Like, they've been quite quick to move on some things. My point more around the narrative is, I think in light of the question, right, the question feels very much about this government seems to have a perception, doesn't want to be perceived as too left-wing, right? And I think that is quite true. I don't think this government is seeking to be down as one of the, seen as a particularly left-wing radical government by any measure. I think they're very keen on being a sort of service delivery, bread and butter, Labor values, rather than sort of going through the hallmarks of all the policies that sit in the party platform that people are really keen to see, but know that it takes quite a lot of time to get there. The things that are sort of a bit of the top shelf sort of stuff, I guess, with respect to sort of the social democratic view. That being said, there's lots of things they have done. I think the question is whether they trumpet those things in the same way that they trumpet kind of their delivery on the service, like the service delivery and the service basics stuff. But there have been some, like I said, there have been some really great things that have been achieved, and there's a lot more to be done. But I guess, particularly from respect to the fights that unions have had with the government, if you got everything you asked for in the dispute, you didn't ask for enough in the campaign, right? So, there is always going to be things that we are going to be campaigning for to get more out of a government, and it's going to be the role of the government to deliver the things that they're expected to do, or that they've been persuaded to do, or that are going to help them win electorally. That seems very much that seems to me and I'm an outsider in it. I don't work for the government. Had lots of my mates work in it, and it's great to have disputes with them all the time about policy settings. It makes for really interesting barbecues on the weekend with your friends, or when some of your mates are ministers or MPs. But that's part of the government, right? It's meant to have these, and particularly within the Labor movement and the party, it's meant to be a big, vigorous democracy of debate and conflict. It's one of the great things about being a member of the Labor Party is you go along to a conference that is I've been to one Victorian one, and it's okay, but it's not nearly the same as New South Wales.
Yours is definitely better than ours.
Yeah, New South Wales is the closest thing almost like a US political convention style conference. They're big theatres for debate and yelling, and I've seen ministers, members of the parliaments condemn each other on the floor, then go get a beer afterwards, right? That is part of the theatre of of having these big, vigorous debates. And that's important. If there's not conflict and dispute, we're not going to get any better. I'd hate to be in one of the rooms of some of those other political parties where it's closed off, you can't see it, and presumably either very vicious and not collegiate or super stale and stagnant and nothing's getting debated.
The Greens. While I've got you, Todd, and we just talked about the unions there, I'm keen to get your thoughts on sort of more of a broader conversation about where the union movement is. I was overseas just recently, and I had the pleasure of meeting some folks from the trade union movement in France off the back of a big national strike. Surprise, surprise, the French were having a strike. And they were asking me about the Australian trade union movement, and it sort of made me sort of have to reflect on the Australian trade union movement in this moment. And I sort of said, I think that things are going reasonably well. It's not perfect, but listening to how they were talking about how their union movement was going in France and more broadly in Western Europe, we seem to be in a much better shape than the French are. And I was just thinking about the Qantas decision. We talked about this on the podcast a couple of weeks ago, a huge moment for the movement. I know there's obviously a lot of challenges, particularly in sort of emerging economies like the gig economy. Both you and I are former employees of the Transport Workers Union that covers those particular workers. So that's a challenge that's very close to our own work experiences, and density continues to fall. But, where do you see the union movement heading in the next 10, 15 years? Like, is it a positive story that we're predicting, or is it just sort of more gradual decline? Like, where do you think we're going?
I'm an optimist, and I think that's because I think that story is it's for us to tell. We're coming up to a pretty critical juncture. So, I mean, the average age of a union member is pretty high, right? So and demography to some extent is some destiny. So there is, for all the older Gen X or baby boomer members, right, who are facing retirement around the same time, there's a bit of a cliff, right? But at the same time, I've been doing a lot of research and doing a lot of conversations with like Gen Z members and a lot of potential members. And I'm getting a real sense, like I'm very optimistic about the future of the union movement because the kids are all right. Like they have really, this generation of young people really does see the exploitation that occurs in the workplace. They seem to have a really deep understanding about power dynamics in a way that you kind of had to explain to millennials. Like I think the sort of hustle culture that has sort of driven a lot of millennials to do hours and hours of unpaid overtime in pursuit of promotions to achieve enough money to save to buy a house. I just don't think the next generation is buying that at all. And I think they genuinely feel they have quite a recognition of power dynamics. They sort of have a rejection of sort of this old model or this old promise that if you just worked hard and, give your life over to your boss, you'll have a quality life afterwards. They get a real sense of the economics. And I think that has made unions very relevant to them. The question will be whether unions can fill the knowledge gap and make us relevant to them. So in the sense that they are very relevant to us, they should be the future of the union. And I think there's huge numbers of young people who are very, very open to joining unions. It's the question of whether unions can make themselves relevant to them and show that by joining a union it can solve some of these problems, and not just the economic, industrial issues that a worker faces every day, but also these broader social issues. Like there's a lot of movements. You'll see unions obviously speaking out a whole variety of things that are happening respect to what's happening in the Middle East, on broader topics like housing or renters' rights. I mean, unions as well as where I work, we've done a lot of advocacy in the immigration space for migrant workers and workers on visas. I mean, one of the fastest growing cohorts of Australians is international students who fall in love with the country and decide to stick around. And they're highly trained, they're well integrated, and they love this country. And there's a question whether this country will do enough to support them and make sure that they get the same industrial rights, because every worker in Australia should be entitled to the exact same industrial conditions and support. It's that advocacy, I think, on the kind of the whole of the worker. Like we talk about in union world, like you've got to think about the whole worker as a human being, not just what can we do for you 9 to 5, but what can we do for you throughout your entire life. So if we can make that challenge and make ourselves relevant to Gen Z, I always forget which one I'm meant to call it. But if we can make ourselves relevant to them, I think there is a lot of upside, a lot of opportunity, but it's going to mean unions are going to have to find ways to open themselves up to young people. And I was just chatting to our comms team this week about some of the like unhinged content ideas that they have that are in keeping with the kind of things that like people under 24 are currently watching, that to me make no sense, but apparently are very viral and very exciting. Like, we've got to find a way to speak that language, because if we just talk like we did in the 1850s or we did in the 1980s, we're gonna miss the mark. And like, language is the currency of authenticity. Like, how we speak about our issues is how we're going to have that authenticity to bring them into union. So I'm optimistic. Plus, also, all these new rights and conditions that Labor governments have been granting have been great for unions and great for working people. We're seeing wages going up, job security improve. It's all happy days, but we've got to keep going in the right direction.
What do you think is the barrier for a young person from joining the union? You said there's an interest there, but what's holding them back?
So I guess things like, how would you, like, if you had to ask some questions to them, like, how would you join? Like, are you going to go Google it, look it up? You got to go provide a whole bunch of your online, your personal information into a form somewhere, sorts of things that young people might actually be quite uninterested in doing. Once a union actually, like, what does a union in practice mean? Is it just an organizer I've got on speed dial that I can call when I got a problem? Or is it what actual unionism is, which is that you and your colleagues have formed a union together as, we talk about union as a verb, not as a noun. It's a thing you do with people. It's not a bunch of people employed in an office somewhere. It's you having an agreement that you're going to have each other's back when there's problems in the workplace, and you're going to have some capacity to shape decisions. So we've got to frame all that and make it really relevant. Where I think young people do have some salience about us is where we have spoken out on issues or where we have been big advocates on things. So, I mean, you look back to some of the great things that unions have spoken out or run campaigns on or been involved in. Like, unions were instrumental in the introduction of Medicare. They were instrumental in the creation of the weekend. We've just, following union campaigns, we've got the new right to disconnect, which is going to have a little bit more time to run for people to flow into workplaces. But the things that we have been attached to, and I think young people have a sense of, I like unions. They campaign for things that I like. The question is, how do we get them from there to, well, actually now I'd like to, join them and be part of them, and I'd like to be active within the union. And it's just a matter of also, we've got to get, as I said, language is the currency for authenticity. For us to speak to these members, we've got to speak in the ways that they engage with it. Because the future of the union movement is going to be younger. It's going to be more gender diverse. It's going to be much more culturally diverse. That is the future of the union. That's where it's going to go. And that's going to require, and much like in any election campaign you might do, it's going to require changes to the comms strategy, changes to the media, changes to the socials. And that's going to take time. But I think it's one that I definitely get a sense from the leaders of the movement that they see this challenge. And you can see some of the advocacy that unions are doing. You can see from the way their comm strategies are run, the way organising is done, the new things that they are trying. There's definitely an appetite to try new things.
Interesting things that Todd just shared there. Lissie, interested for your thoughts on that, particularly around the comm stuff as well.
Yeah, I mean, I to be honest, everything Todd's just gone through makes me feel more optimistic as well, because I think it's one of the things, I'm a union member for a long time now, but I guess I worry, I worry about what does the future of the movement look like. Like, numbers haven't necessarily over recent years been going the way we'd want in terms of membership numbers. So, yeah, there's a real challenge. How do you be relevant and stay relevant to a whole new group of people who have not lived through, like work choices, like they don't remember what that was, for instance, one of the last sort of big national campaigns. So I'm encouraged, Todd, that you feel like there's, and you'd have the best visibility of the three of us, that there is that recognition from leadership of the movement that we have to adapt to reach new people. I think, and the comms and the advocacy and the organising, has to all be different to get to different people. To your point, who speak a different language. I will be interested to see how many unions themselves and how far along the journey they are, and whether that's different in different parts of the country. Because I think, there's been a real push. Federal Labor's in power, therefore, organisations like the ACTU kind of much more forward-facing in their advocacy in some places, but. Steve and I have been doing some work on a different project together this week, and there's a difference between advocacy and organising. And I hope our comrades in the movement are putting a lot of effort into the organising bit, because I think while you've got federal Labor, it's not that you don't need to, or state Labor, you do need to advocate, obviously, and Todd, you do a lot of that in your job, but we've got to get new members. And they've got to have a reason to join up.
Let's go to another question. This one's from Robert. I think Robert's a Victorian. And he asks, what can the Commonwealth Government learn from Victoria's treaty with its First Peoples? Lissie, you have been a part of the Andrews government throughout the entire treaty process, and the approach of the Victorian state government and comparing that to the Commonwealth in terms of treaty and self-determination and the things to come out of the Uluru Statement. Couldn't be more contrasting examples. And I just want to get your thoughts on Robert's question.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and I think I'd probably just say to start with, absolute credit where it's due. The treaty process in Victoria was finished and completed from the government side by Jacinta Allen and Nat Hutchins as the minister, who also incidentally was the minister the first time around when it started. So it's nice that she got to do both ends of it. But full credit to the government and to the First Peoples Assembly for pulling this off. To be honest, like, it was a big. I think when the process started, there was a lot of hope for it, but also a lot of question marks about whether enough momentum could be maintained behind it for the effort to last long enough to actually get to this point. And I think it's a pretty extraordinary achievement for all the government and for the First Peoples involved in making it happen. There's a couple of really salient points. I think one, it was not to begin with an election commitment. It's something the government just, listening to First Peoples and what they were asking for, decided to pick up and to do. And it was never a big focus as part of our election campaigning. It was something that the government was just doing. And obviously that went through, government got re-elected twice, so I think you can strongly argue there was a mandate for it, but it was never put front and centre for a reason, because people, unfortunately, and we saw this with The Voice, these things can get weaponised in a way that is really, really damaging. And often, sometimes, unfortunately, prevents the outcome being realised. So, you and I talked about The Voice last time we were on here, Stephen, and which I got into trouble with from The Australian. But I'll say it again, that was a big swing and a big miss from the federal government. And, we can all Monday morning quarterback all of these things, but, the really long lead time, the really high profile they put on it, I think both of those things hurt it a lot. And I think that hopefully, or what I hope for, is that the Victorian example allows other states, and ultimately one day that a federal government, I don't know that it'll be this one, is able to do something like this. Because really what the Victorian example is going to show is that it's fine, and it will make things better, and it will make things worse for nobody. And it is something that recognises historic injustices and will make contemporary policy making better for First Nations people, and in doing so make it better for everybody. And I just think that example, I hope, stands everybody else in the country in good stead. But, the reality is sometimes, and, I'll take Todd's point from earlier about the New South Wales government, sometimes to do really big, important things, sometimes it doesn't need to be front and centre of your messaging that you're talking about to everybody else.
After the yes referendum was lost, it appeared, and I don't know if things have changed, but it appeared that in South Australia, the South Australian Labor government were getting, I won't say cold feet, but their feet were cooling on it, because they had begun a similar process to what we have done in Victoria.
Yeah.
The same in Queensland. I know there's been a change of government now in Queensland, so that's fundamentally shifted the priorities.
And in the Northern Territory as well, change of government, they back straight out of it.
Yep.
Of all places.
New South Wales, Todd, what's happening there in terms of?
They've just begun the consultation process. So there's a commitment that's taken the election. I'm just doing some reading on it. It's not an area I've been heaps involved with, but it is one that they are moving on. There is consultation going on it. But I think there is that, I don't know if the government shares the view that there's sort of, I guess there's that fear out there about this could be the third rail, right? Like this is the sort of thing that when it's out there in the public, it gets weaponized by a whole variety of forces, and it's made out to be much worse or much more impactful negatively than it possibly will. No one's life will be worse off from it, but some people's lives are going to be much better off from it. It's kind of, I think, the way to think about it. But having a look, it looks like it's in consultation process they're looking to move forward on, which is, I think, is good, and I'd be putting more strength to the government's arm on it. It's the sort of thing that needs to get done. And if anything, the case for state governments to move on this space is even stronger in the following the outcome of the voice referendum. And I couldn't endorse more Lissie's views around where that referendum landed and what could have been done, and it was a great shame. But hopefully we're able to pick up the pieces in the campaign again in the future.
I had dinner one night in Sydney when I was up there doing some wonderful work with you guys. I don't even know how the hell I ended up in this dinner, but it was a couple of Sydney Uni academics, and we were in the early state. No, we were in the year of the referendum, and things weren't looking good, but they weren't looking as bad as they ended up transpiring out to be, but they certainly weren't looking good. And I'd sort of said to them, look, I'm a little bit worried about this referendum. I'm worried it's not going to get up. And I'm worried about the strategy that the federal government has adopted here in making it so big and so high profile that you, and I pointed to these two academics, you may feel good about yourself, but if it doesn't get up, then the people it's going to impact, that's the real tragedy. And I said, but in contrast, in my home state, we are so further along this journey of actually achieving a treaty in Victoria. And I said, few people know about it. And I sort of said to them, how does that make you feel? Like, if you had a choice, what path do you choose? And they were like, I want to choose the elbow path. And I was like, that's bonkers. That is insane. We are outcomes driven. This is not about how we feel. The people that we are talking about is Aboriginal Victorians or in First Peoples across this country. They're the people we should be worrying about, and that's what we should be focusing on. Not like I didn't say to them, you're just doing this to make you feel good, but that was the vibe that was coming off their argument, And I walked away from that dinner going, this worries me a lot. And it didn't get up anyway, right? So, but I'm pleased to hear that the New South Wales Labor government are still focused on going down this path because, it is important.
I think, Stephen, something else I'd maybe add to the whole way this is played out in Victoria, which I hope carries through to New South Wales and other states that try to do this as well. And this podcast and I've spent plenty of time criticising the media for their various things. One shout-out I will give is that of late, at least, The Age, with whom I take issue on many other things, have in their reporting about treaty, particularly this year, they have gone to the effort of when they are reporting about people sort of saying things about the treaty that are not true, they've actually clearly in their reporting said, this is false, this is not correct, that sort of thing. And I'd say partly it's so notable because they don't normally do that on what I think they should in many other things. But it has actually, it does make a difference when the media just report, some other politician who opposes it or some other, commentator or whatever, alleges wild, outrageously untrue thing and just reports it with no fact check on it at all. And that is one of the things, it's not the only thing, but is one of the things that allows these fear campaigns to build the kind of momentum we saw during The Voice, where the whole thing just got completely out of control. And so, small credit where it's due, I'd say The Age, at least in Victoria, has particularly recently gone to the effort of being responsible in their reporting about that. And I think, they're all 1%ers, but in the end they all add up.
We've got a bunch of questions also, and I'm just sort of combining them all into one from folks about US politics. And I know that we've got a whole bunch of US politics tragics on the show today, so let's go there. Saving the good bits till last. And so I'm just going to sort of synthesize all the different kind of thoughts and discussion points that were sent in to us. A lot of these were sent to me directly, by the way, not on the Patreon group chat. But thank you. So I won't name everyone because there's too many. And I'm going to put it to both of you. What are we making about the response by the Democratic Party to the Trump administration. And we're getting this contrast of different approaches, between the California governor, Gavin Newsom, who is effectively always trolling President Trump on social media, versus minority Senate leader Chuck Schumer, who originally has been very, very cautious in the early days, but now we're starting to see, particularly with the Senate didn't vote to support the continuing resolution, which has led to this government shutdown. Meanwhile, a lot of people are getting very excited about this New York councillor, Zoran Mamdani, who's won the Democratic primary to be the Democratic candidate for the New York mayoral race, which will be happening in November, which is next month, by beating the former governor of New York State, Andrew Cuomo. So there's a lot going on, and I'm just keen to get your thoughts on both your thoughts on how do the Democrats respond to it. Before we do, let's play this clip. Let's start with Governor Gavin Newsom.
You've been getting a lot of attention lately. I'm sure you're well aware. You've got this new communication strategy, or at least new for a Democrat. It's called, I'm pronouncing this correctly, being interesting. And when did it occur to you? When did the lightning bulb go on over your head that perhaps you should do something that was kind of funny and makes a point? Where did this strategy come from? Because let's give the people an idea of what it is.
Yeah, what do we got?
Here's an example of you aping someone's style. I'm not going to say who. And it says, "Wow, what an honor on Mount Rushmore. Thank you." Okay. Wow, an honor. Thank you. Nobel Peace Prize. So
feels good.
It does.
It does. It feels
congratulations.
Good. By the way, thank you for acknowledging. Yes.
Well, you got to. You earned that. You earned that. Sure.
Yeah. No, and that. Well, look. Yeah. The strategy is inspiration, desperation, right? The two driving forces of life. And everything we were doing to try to break through wasn't working anymore. And so we decided to do something, to your point, a novel called humor. And I got to say, oftentimes Democrats, we're a little, we're not as humorous as we should be. A
little stiff.
It could be a little stiff.
Yeah.
And so we thought we'd have some fun with it. But I never imagined it would break through like it has and get under the skin of the President of the United States and some of my friends.
All right, there we go. Governor Gavin Newsom discovering that humour is a way to respond to his opponents. Lissie, what do you make of Governor Gavin Newsom?
Oh, I'm all about it, Stephen. I don't check Twitter that much other than for excellent trained content and now his stuff. I think, yes, he's right to say like they've found a way to make things funny, which is obviously more engaging. But the other thing is like he's having a crack, like he's having a proper fight. And I think part of what the Democrats have had their problem with is that, well, one, they don't have a leader right now, which is obviously a little bit difficult because there's congressional leadership and then there's people like, AOC who've got their own massive followings, and then there's the governors. And so nobody's in charge of the party right now because they're in between their presidential cycles. But he's decided he's not waiting around. Newsom's not going to wait around for somebody else. He's like, well, my state's under attack and this is all, bullshit. So I'm in. And I think, good on him and his team for trying something different. And I think, some of their content is pretty next level. But he's declared himself the leader of the free world, and he's taken on the United Nations, and he's thanked the clips about being on Mount Rushmore and all this other stuff. Like all of it's crazy, but equally, trying to hold a mirror up and saying, well, you think it's crazy when I'm doing it, like the president's doing it. So I think it's effective. I think it. And I think domestically, I think it'll be effective for him at a state. And obviously, it's a state that he's trying to run. And I think it's, people want someone to stand up for them, and like that, and that's what he's doing. So, frankly, all power to him. More of it.
Todd, from one good-looking bloke to another, do you think Gavin Newsom is too good-looking to? Obviously, he's got presidential aspirations. Do you think he's just too goddamn good-looking to be president?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm all for King Newsom. I think he's doing a cracking job in terms of like having a go. I don't think him being too good looking is an issue or anything. I think what's interesting about him is, yes, it's definitely this sense about him having a go. I think Lissie absolutely hit it on the head, right? Like you'd want to back a winner. Like if you were the Democrats, if you were a Democratic voter out there right now, you're just sick of losing. Like you're sick of getting beaten by this guy who, on by every measure of all the rules and the norms, should be, in some cases, like some people would say, in prison, should never have been elected as a candidate. I think they like the idea of Newsom having a go. I also like that he's put a particular brand of like, how can the Democrats throw out the rule book a little bit, fight fire with fire without actually doing the same thing that Trump is doing? So, gerrymandering your own electorate, but doing it via a referendum or a plebiscite. Allowing people to say, actually, we're going to put some political power in the hands of the people, and we're going to fight back. I think that's brilliant. I think him trolling and being quite funny in the content is good. It's clearly getting under Trump's skin. I also think just this early kind of, they might describe it as like peacocking, right? Like this kind of early getting out there and showing, because for Gavin to win the primary, should he decide he's going to put his hand up, he's going to need to get an early lead now. He's not an easy contender for it, being a California governor, California Democrat. There's definitely going to be views within the party that they need to elect someone from the South or the Midwest as a candidate. So I think him being able to go out really early and just show a bit of fight and a bit of ticker, I think is going to be really helpful. And like I said, it's clearly getting under Trump's skin. And that's the thing. If you can draw level with the president, like they always say, like in US election campaigns, there's always a real bump for the challenger candidate when they have the presidential election, because you put both of them on the same day on a pedestal and people start thinking about him. Like he's drawing level with the president and the president's drawing level with him. That's a clever strategy to be doing 2 years out. I also think Newsom has also found a way to communicate where he's not explicitly trying to be the most left-wing candidate in the field. Like, I mean, I watched the interview that he did with Charlie Kirk, right? Like some time ago. He's quite interested in going into spaces where people aren't going to agree with him, and he's going to have the conversation. He's going to win them over. I think that's quite courageous and quite good. In a way that I know a lot was made at the last election about the reluctance for Democratic candidates to go on, say, a whole variety of the sort of manosphere style podcasts where the Republicans were going. Like if you're strong in your argument and you're strong in your values, you should have no problem going and debating anyone, right? Isn't that's kind of the idea. So no, I'm all for it. I think he's doing really good. With respect to the other candidates, I think there's a whole lot of really interesting talent coming up through the Democratic Party. And maybe that's partly because you learn a lot more from a loss than a win. Like when they won under Biden, I think there was a view of like, okay, well, the lesson here is just do the same thing we've always been doing. Like this will always work. And they didn't learn some of the lessons that like maybe Biden was just the right candidate for that time. The loss under Harris, I think, has inspired them to go, well, we've got to throw the rule book out. We're going to try a whole bunch of new things because the fate of the free world is kind of in the hands of what we do in the next 2 years. So why not do unhinged content if that's what gets us in front of eyeballs?
Let's have a listen to another clip, and this is a clip. There's a video here of, if you're not watching on YouTube, it's Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez walking through a park. I think it's actually next to the Capitol building itself, and they're doing a bit of a walk to camera, like a slowed down version of the West Wing, explaining why the Democrats voted down the continuing resolution and the impact it's going to be having on healthcare. So let's have a quick listen to this.
Hey, everybody. I was walking here in Washington, D.C., and who did I bump into? One of my favorite members of the United States Congress, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
And one of my favorite senators.
All right. As everybody knows, we are now in a government shutdown. Republicans are attacking Alexandria, attacking me. Why didn't you vote for this clean CR to keep the government open?
Well, there's nothing clean about it. This is one of the dirtiest tricks that is being pulled on the American people right now. Starting today, October 1st, and throughout the rest of the month, Americans across this country are going to start getting notifications that their insurance premiums are up to doubling. That means people getting bankrupt over chemotherapy, people going to the pharmacy and not being able to get their insulin. And frankly, it means a lot of Americans are going to be in danger.
It doesn't make me happy to have to say this, but there have been studies out there that when you combine doubling premiums for the ACA and then throwing 15 million people off of Medicaid and the ACA, the result is, according to studies at Yale and the University of Pennsylvania, 50,000 low-income, working-class Americans will die every single year. All right?
And so Republicans want us to rubber stamp that, and we're saying no.
Remember, right now we're the only major country on earth not to guarantee health care to all people, and these guys want to make it even worse. We're not going to let that happen.
No, we're not.
Thank you.
Onward.
Okay, Lissie, thoughts on that clip from Bernie and AOC, who have done a bit of a sort of a tandem road trip across America just recently as well with their, what was it called again? The Fight Back the Oligarchy or something?
Fighting oligarchy too. I think there's a passing of the baton happening there, because obviously Bernie's getting on a bit. But yeah, look, if you are watching the video, it's not exactly scintillating visual content, but I think that one's maybe a little bit notable in the sense that is it the best messaging any of us have ever heard? No, but is it better than most of what is coming out of Democratic leadership right now about why they have forced the shutdown? Yes, and I think they've decided healthcare is the issue. They had the opportunity to do the shutdown earlier in the year, and they blinked and they didn't, which caused a lot of internal strife within the Democratic caucus and a lot of, I think, backlash from a lot of Democratic voters as well. But they've decided to draw the line now. They're standing the ground at this point. But I think, it's about health. They've said healthcare is their issue, which means you've got to explain to people why healthcare is the thing that is worth all the pain of a shutdown. And it looks like the shutdown is going to endure a little bit at least, whether we might be lapped by the time this goes out. But the Republicans are trying to pick off Democratic senators. They only need 5, I think. Or 5 more than they've already got, and you've got to give people a reason. Like, shutdown's painful. A lot of people are not getting paid. Public services are not happening. There's got to be a reason for it. There's got to be a why. And I think people like AOC are doing a better job of explaining the why than some of the people who are perhaps more senior in the party. But if they can't explain that, people will not stay with them. They will lose the argument. They will lose the politics, and ultimately they'll get flattened by the administration.
Todd, one of the things that struck me when I was over in the States when actually Lissie as well was over in the States for the presidential, and watching a lot of the commentary, the communication from the two respective campaigns. And Bill Clinton always said a campaign needs to make it about their lives, not about ours, and everything's going to be okay. The Democrats, I thought, failed to talk about the issues that voters were confronting on a daily basis. And certainly in this piece here, that's front and center, that this is how this is going to impact your life. Do you think that there are Democrats across the board are learning that lesson from the presidential? Are we seeing more from them in terms of actually starting to talk about the meaningful benefits that will impact voters?
Yeah, I think so. As I said, I think it's always been true. Like my thought's always been that you learn a lot more from a loss than a win, right? There's a great learning opportunity and reflection after a loss because you can have a real honest conversation about things. You're seeing like a whole new crop of Democratic candidates who are popping up, particularly challenging in primaries, like talking about Zoran Mandani, like people who are communicating not just about the issue that people care about, but in the ways that they want to hear about the information. So it's one thing to do a speech about healthcare in the Senate that's just full of facts and figures that doesn't communicate with them. It's another one to go for a walk with AOC down the street and actually talk about it in real context. It's one thing to talk about how the cost of living is hurting people. It's another for when Mandani does a series of videos where he's reflecting on things like talking about free bus tickets or about childcare, like really trying to communicate with people in the form that they do, right? We just have to accept that, like, one, you've got to be relevant to the voter, and two, your message, the medium of your message is also got to be relevant. And so I think you are starting to see a lot of this content. And I mean, you're starting to see some of these like Mamdani sort of similar pop-up candidates running. I see that there's someone with a similar sort of style, comms background who's running a challenge on Nancy Pelosi. There's a few other candidates, a few other paces popped up. I know I got one on TikTok the other day from a candidate in New Jersey. Like, you're starting to see people who are like particularly young, like millennials, who are using the medium that they understand and talking about everyday working class issues and connecting with voters for it. Like, there's something in that. A lot of this also, I would say, a lot of this is inspired by Bernie. So I don't think we can underestimate the degree to which Bernie's electoral challenge against Hillary in 2012, yeah. Really inspired an entire generation of left-wing voters to get involved in the Democratic Party, particularly young people. And I think a lot of them are running with a view of they want to kind of fulfill the promise of Bernie. Like you can see that a little bit in the comms between Bernie and AOC. There's a bit of a legacy, a bit of an agenda and unfinished. He didn't get his chance to do it, so there's some of us who are going to step up and do it.
Yeah,
and Darby, I think it's that bill too.
Yeah, I think they look like, and Bernie's going around and meeting them all, and he's physically and metaphorically handing over the torch. I think that's pretty, like, there's something really powerful in that. The real question, go back to our earlier conversation, is can Gavin tap into that? Because Newsom is much more of your classic Democratic candidate, coastal elite. Establishment, right? Like, how does he present himself as that person? Well, you can see it in some of the comms he's doing. Real question will be whether he can harness that energy. I think a Newsom AOC ticket would be pretty incredible to watch. I don't know if that's what will happen, but
oh god,
I think it's pretty cool, man.
I agree on enough things to say on the same ticket.
But I think maybe that's why it would work, right? Isn't that counterbalancing views? They're going to have debates. Like, maybe that's the trick. Maybe they do need to swing at that, or we can do what they've always done, which is two candidates with exact agreement on all things of the same age. So if one of them has to stop being the president, don't worry, you've got exactly what you voted for again. Like, maybe that's not actually what's needed.
Can I be the devil's advocate there and just point out that the people that we're talking about so far are all from blue states, and we're singing the praises of the things that they've all done when they're basically running in a closed shop. Like, Mamdani basically just won a Labor Party pre-selection in Western Sydney. Like, whoop-de-doo. That's not a big thing. Like, it's not that hard.
If it's a safe seat, man, that's pretty hard to do.
Well, yeah, that's true. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's like against Andrew Cuomo, whose name is mud amongst registered Democratic voters in New York. Gavin Newsom is the governor for California, for God's sake. Like, these aren't people that are cutting their teeth in contests that are in purple districts or purple states. And we continue to elevate these people in between cycles. They get the nomination and then they proceed to fuck it up because they're completely out of touch with the places that need to win elections, which is to the states you just mentioned before, Todd, the Midwest. Shapiro in Pennsylvania, Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan. It's places like those states where we should be, I think, be looking to and saying, what are you doing to connect with voters that we've lost? Because it doesn't matter what happens in New York. It doesn't matter what happens in California. It matters what happens in Pennsylvania. It matters what happens in places like Michigan.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't just – sorry, you go.
No, I was going to say, well, that means a fair point, Stephen. Maybe, part of the reason that, people like the ones we've been talking about have time to go and do all this fighting on the national stage is because they don't have to fight at home, other than, in the pre-selection sense. So I think that's a fair point. But I'd also say, to Todd's point earlier, if you're going to be a successful presidential candidate, you've got to have a national profile. And I'd say, times are ticking. Yeah. So, with those people, whether it's Whitmer or Shapiro or anyone else, I consume a fair bit of American media and digital content. If you want to run, get out there. The time is now. Don't sit around waiting. So, yeah, I think that's a fair point. And I think, people like Newsom, California's got a lot of problems. Todd mentioned abundance earlier. I don't think that book was written for Australia, but it was written about California. There's a lot of domestic issues that you can run a campaign against someone from California and say that place has got a lot of problems we don't want imported to the rest of the country. So he's got a lot of weaknesses on that side too. But the time to stand up is now.
Couldn't agree more. I mean, I think Shapiro and Whitmer both are very strong candidates on paper, but where's the building of the national profile? Where is the connecting with younger voters? Where is adding themselves to the national voice? I'm sure that they are doing things in this space, but if it's not leaching out, also from a sense of what is three Australians, consuming American media, what's our take on it, right? But I would think as to the point now, like now is the time for these people to be stepping up and taking Trump on and building these national profiles and getting themselves ready. But I also make the point, it's very hard for us to apply an Australian lens about, you've got to go to the centre when they've got we have optional voting and a first past the post system. If you're not firing up the base of Democratic voters, you're not winning. You don't, like, swing voters matter in a high turnout election. And in a Trump election, we've known that there can be higher turnout because there's a real surge of Democrats to defeat Trump. You've really got to turn that up to the highest levels in order to win, because if you can't drive the turnout, you can't win. And that was definitely a lesson from the last election. So maybe some of these Democrats from these solely blue states are part of the solution, as long as they can be seen as palpable to and not a threat to some of these purple states, target states.
It's going to be fascinating. And we've got, three more years to go. It feels like we're at the halfway point of the Trump administration, but we are not even through. We're not even through the first year.
Not even at the midterms yet.
And by the time this podcast airs, we will know whether Trump won the Nobel Peace Prize or not.
Yeah.
It's tomorrow.
Yeah. And we'll also find out whether or not the government shutdown's completely ruined the US mission as we try to get all of our delegates into the country and into Washington, DC. So much to worry about.
I'll give yourself a tour of the Capitol building because there won't be anyone else around.
Yeah, I know. Smithsonian will be shut. Oh, God. Anyway, things I have to worry about for later. Wonderful to see you both. Thank you so much for your contribution to today's podcast. Todd, great to see you. Good luck with all of the work you're doing with Unions New South Wales.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me. Look forward to a future episode if I make the cut.
Indeed you will. And Lissie Ratcliff, thank you so much for coming on the show and giving your contribution today as well.
Thank you, Stephen. Happy to make a contribution to stealing David Feeney's spotlight.
I know. He's going to be... I'm not going to hear the end of this.
Well, we saved the AUKUS question for him, and I think that was a great contribution on our part.
And thank you to all of our Patreon subscribers for sending through your topics and discussion points today. Really appreciate it. If you want to support the show, join our Patreon. There's a link in the show notes. And two, we'll be doing this again in November. We'll do another Mailbag episode, and we'll post it up on the chat thing in Patreon closer to the date. So we look forward to you guys sending through your topics. So Todd and Lissie can share their thoughts. Thanks, guys, and we'll see you in a month.
See you then.
Hey, Social Democrats. Thanks for listening. Today's episode was hosted by myself, Stephen Donnelly, and produced by Grace Eyre. If you like the show, please rate us and review us wherever you get your podcasts. And a big thank you to our newest paid Patreon members that have joined our socially democratic community on Patreon, including Billy, Claire, Zach Moran, Stipend, James, and Paul Keating's biggest fan. Thought I was Paul Keating's biggest fan, but evidently there is another one out there. Don't forget, when you join our Patreon community as a paid member, you can get questions in ahead of our Feeney Files with Jason McCrone and our now, hopefully every month, Mailbag episode with our special guests. And then you can join the discussion after the episode drops. So all you need to do is click on the link in the show notes and join our Patreon community. And you'll be contributing financially to support our podcast, which we greatly appreciate. So thanks to those folks that have joined. See you next Friday.